Here we go.
I'm gonna count to 3, and I need someone else to clap at the same time as I am, so that I can sync up the audios better. Okay.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Okay. That I kind of had a chance, but.
Okay. So basically, with that beautiful introduction, let's begin.
Okay, Andres, I think you're the best one at this.
Okay, so today we have initiated the second edition of our podcast, Pickle Boys, and we have a very special guest coming in from our school, Ali Frericks. She is a junior in ISP, and she came here today to discuss identity politics with us. We also have a listener, Henry Nakahira, who will be assisting us with the technical difficulties which we may experience during this video call. And with that being said, let's start by asking Ali Frericks some basic questions so that we understand what identity politics are and where we align ourselves in some of these controversial topics, which have a very heavy weight on our politics in the United States today. So, Ali, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I guess you couldn't have said it any better. I'm a junior at ISP, and I resonate with identity politics a lot as someone who has a lot of different social backgrounds, I guess, because I grew up with an American father and a Bolivian mother. So I'm a mixed kid, and I grew up in that really cultural hotspot kind of environment, especially with the fact that I've lived in 7 different countries, and I'm only 16. So I've had quite my fair share of witnessing different cultures, learning new languages, and really resonating with different ethnicities. So identity politics is something that's very important to me, and is definitely something that should be taken into account when we're approaching national politics.
How do you define identity politics, and why do you feel like it is so important for every American to consider identity politics when voting?
So identity politics refers to a political approach that focuses on religion, race, social background, etc., which then forms exclusive political alliances. And I think that's something very important to consider when someone is voting or just involved in the political community in general, because it's something that has an impact on the way one really resonates with certain ideas, different beliefs. And I think that's especially important when deciding who we're going to vote for. I mean, the presidential elections are coming up this year, and I think a question that's been inside of us this whole time is who exactly we're going to vote for. And I think identity politics plays a big role in that, because we have to really analyze ourselves, analyze our priorities, where we come from, what we want from the next presidency, and which candidate can give us that. So I think identity politics is something that should be very important to each and every American.
I believe that identity politics can have a negative effect on people, on the people of the United States, especially considering how the right has also started to adopt different opinions and perspectives on identity politics, especially concerning white supremacy.
Definitely. And I think this can happen to anyone, really, not just the question of white supremacy, but if a certain group of people, one community, begins to feel a sense of superiority, a sense of pride, and this can be both pride for their own community or superiority over others, then that can lead to some sort of conflict, some sort of violence that could interrupt the peaceful approach that we're trying to make toward politics. And I think that for that reason, we have to be careful when approaching identity politics, because we have to keep in mind that even though we're different, we're all equal. And just because there are different religions, different races, different ethnicities, different languages being spoken, we all want the best thing for our country, for our future. So it's not about who's better than the other or who's just superior, I guess. It's more about seeing ourselves at one equal level and just identifying those differences and really appreciating them.
Where do you draw the line for the extremities of identity politics?
I think once those identity politics become rather violent and too extreme, in the sense where there's noticeable conflicts rising because of identity politics, is when we're really going to start having an issue. I think, for example, using your previous remark of white supremacy, I think when Donald Trump was first elected to office in 2016, a few weeks after the election, we saw that a group of people in Charlottesville, Virginia, began demonstrating at a square of white supremacy, and they were carrying Confederate flags, burning tires, just engaging in very aggressive and violent behavior. I think that's an example of when identity politics are too extreme, and I'm in no way justifying the mindset of that group of people, because at the end of the day, we each have our right to resonate with one specific community where we share those identity politics. But I think once it's out of hand, once they're causing harm to others, once we're a threat to the general society, that's when there's an issue.
Okay, so from my mostly moderate perspective, I see that where you're coming from is definitely correct, that white supremacy is obviously condemnable, and it's horrible, and it shouldn't exist at all. No race or ethnicity should find themselves superior to others. But we're diving into one of the first topics here, which is affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy which has been adopted across the United States, which helps minorities get jobs, get into college, get benefits which they usually wouldn't get. But in recent years, affirmative action has had an agenda, or affirmative action policies have had an agenda which give minorities these jobs or these opportunities, even if they don't deserve that based on merit. And because of this has made a lot of minorities who now have job titles because of that, or college degrees because of that, not have the same credentials as some other people who would obviously earn these things because of their own merit. And obviously, this is only a small minority, but it is causing a reaction such as what we can see in Charlottesville. So how do you believe that affirmative action has affected the world of identity politics, especially since it has been so controversial on the right and it has seen so much of a reaction against minorities today? How do you see that this policy, which was supposed to benefit minorities and make us more united, has actually divided us more?
Well, yeah, that's totally true. Affirmative action has divided us, and we can see that especially in the rise of the presidency of Donald Trump, when a lot of his supporters started condemning the fact that Mexican workers were working, and they were being provided with these opportunities to be gaining a salary, having a job, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the supporters were condemning this because they'd give the argument that they're stealing our work, or they're illegal here. They shouldn't be provided with those jobs. But so that's a very clear example of how this affirmative action has been dividing us as a society. But I think as Americans, we should all think of how, most importantly, it's been uniting us, because it's been providing with those who are a little more underprivileged with very important opportunities. As a Hispanic especially, I can very much sympathize with the prejudice and the discrimination that Latinos face in the workforce, in education in the United States. So I think that before we point fingers and say, oh, these people are stealing our work, we have to really say that we're providing these people with equal opportunities. And quite honestly,
Yes.
I think we lost Ali.
We're having some technical difficulties here.
Okay. These technical difficulties are no more. So, leaving where she left off, how are you guys feeling about these topics that we're discussing about? You don't have to agree with all she said. So, do you all have different opinions on some things, on some matters?
I was about to rebuttal her because she stated that affirmative action was uniting the country and that it was providing a basis for minorities to gain because of their merit and because of everything that they've earned. But looking at this from a statistical point of view, although I definitely believe in the uplifting of minorities and how they should be included and assimilated into American society, proof that the average score for college entry is at a certain marker, and however, whenever minorities put in a score which is below that marker, they have even more chances of white children of getting into that same university, even though they have lower scores, and those white children have higher scores. So, although I do believe that this policy could be potentially amazing for the minority class, I believe it's gone a step too far. And instead of providing them with a system which is going to make them feel more confident than they should be in their own ability, we should be creating a system in which they can actually be uplifted during their younger years, when they're 0 to 18, so that they can actually have these average test scores, and better yet, these above average test scores. So, we can uplift them and show the people around them that they are just as hardworking and probably even more hardworking than the white kids who are getting these test scores.
I totally agree with that. I find it kind of ironic how people try to resolve inequality between different minority groups by giving those minority groups that might be in a disadvantage an advantage over those other groups. It's like kind of fighting fire with fire, and at the end of the day, in the long run, that would actually hurt most of the population, because now a minority has an advantage over them. And so because of this, I do not completely agree with this. I think that these types of solutions are good for the short run, but in the long run, at the end of the day, they are detrimental to a country and society. And instead, countries should look for a solution that would take more time to implement, but at the end of the day would be more effective, such as education and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree with what Hugo says. I think that in general we tend to think of identity politics and ask questions like good or bad, or exist or not. And I think that they should exist, and to some extent are fine and are actually healthy, because I think that one of the benefits of identity politics is that it serves as a signal of where we're strong in a society or a community. And I agree with what Hugo says, that up to some point, because of identical politics, we focus solely on a certain topic, and in a way not pay as much attention to others, and then we begin to become destructive. And that's when identity politics reaches that goal of what Hugo was saying, and as we were saying before, that's become destructive, and which what we can see with affirmative action. So I honestly believe that the real question, a real challenge that the government faces, and what we have to start to do, is how can we use identity politics to strengthen our society and system? Because as we've seen before, we have the two ends of the spectrum, and they're becoming more into themselves and more polarized, and we have to find a way to how can we integrate identity politics to work for tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think to further Lucas's point, I think one way that we'd be able to really take on the issue of affirmative action would be to integrate minority groups from the beginning, instead of trying to have them involved once they're applying to colleges or applying for jobs. I think a great way to improve the system would be to do so from birth, I guess, from the very beginning, so that way they don't miss out on anything during that time from when they're born to when they're applying for the bigger things in life. And I think this could be in ways such as with providing them with a better education, providing them with more access to different resources. This could be healthcare or tutoring or other things like that, which will help them develop the life skills that they'll need later. So that way no one's at an unfair advantage. That way everyone is provided with a baseline of something, because naturally some people will have more than others, especially because some people are just wealthier, more privileged than others. But if we're providing with everyone with kind of a base, a minimum amount of resources and aid, then I think everyone will be much better off in the system, and no one will then be at an unfair advantage.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems I have with the Democratic Party at this moment, because they seem to be pushing for an agenda of actually separating when they should be uniting. Because once again, my fundamental problem with affirmative action is that it continually divides Americans, because Americans aren't supposed to be a specific color, they're not supposed to be a specific race, they're not supposed to be a specific sexual orientation, but because of this sexual orientation, or because of their race, or because of their ethnicity, they are getting into colleges. They because they're seen as diverse, they are getting the benefit of the doubt. But what we should be doing is looking at people based on their merit. This is what I've been saying, because if we see how people have acted instead of what their actual identity or personality is, then you'll be getting a more accurate view of who these people are, how they're going to act in the workplace, how they're going to act when they're in a position of power, and how they're going to be able to benefit our country in the long run, as Hugo has been saying.
And actually, I would agree with that, Andres. And I'd also like to point out one of the dangers of identity politics. So, for example, last year, I actually wrote an essay on the subject of identity politics for my capstone project in English. And one of the most important things that I found of identity politics, and one of its most negative effects, is its effect on voting. Now, for example, typically one would assume that for a candidate to be liked by someone, or for someone to vote for that candidate, one would have to agree with their views, one would have to agree with their platform in general, or at least agree with the concept that they were electable, something which is increasingly relevant in the upcoming election. Now, identity politics, the problem with identity politics is the fact that depending on your location, depending on the culture you belong in, depending on the society that you live in, your views alter and become that of that society or that group in reality. And for example, one of the most important examples I found of this was actually the comparing Latinos, or rather Hispanics, in the United States versus Latinos in Central America. And something really interesting is the fact that, for example, Central American or South American Latinos are typically considered as being more conservative, more aligned with Catholic values. On the other hand, many Hispanics in the United States, in part due to Donald Trump's influence on US politics, have actually shifted towards the Democratic Party. This can be seen, for example, in states such as Texas, which have a large Democratic population. And this really is so important because nowadays, the point I'm trying to make is that nowadays, many people, instead of actually learning about a candidate, simply because, not because they agree with a candidate's platform, but simply because that candidate fits with their identity politics or what they believe in, simply because of that, they will vote for another candidate. And this is really dangerous. For example, we could even compare it to historical events throughout history, for example, and this is going to get some sighs from the crowd, but in 1930s Germany, if we were to compare this to, for example, the election of the Nazi Party to the parliament in Germany, the nation was so divided, as we can see nowadays in the United States, that they united behind a single banner that seemed to unite, seemed to unify behind nationalism and the common goal of being really German. And yet, look where this got them. We all know where that got them.
Remember, that was only 36% of the population, and that Hitler only came into power because of the emergency powers, which were implemented by the Weimar Republic in 1918.
Of course, Andres, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. Let's not get too historical. So basically, the point that I'm actually trying to make is that the fact that Hitler was even elected, even though his views were anti-Semitic, his views were racist, and everybody knew this. His views were public. It's not like he was hiding them. Everybody knew about these views, but they chose to ignore this simply because Hitler's identity profile simply coincided with theirs. He felt that immigrants were destroying the country. He felt that people weren't being sufficiently German, that Jews were evil, that Jews were destroying the economy. And many people identified with this because of the socioeconomic strife that Germany faced. Now, of course, we might be going a bit too far comparing this with nowadays, but it's quite relevant, I think. So I'd just like to know what Ali thinks about this, really. And I know I did say a lot, but generally.
Well, I completely agree. For one, I think that voters will vote for someone who really resonates with their identity. I think that there's many clear examples of that in the past, like the one that you just gave of Hitler in Germany in the 1930s. But I, for one, completely agree. And I think that one way that we'd be able to change this is by having a set of rules, I guess, that would allow for fewer candidates to appoint themselves to run for presidency. For example, this past few months, we've seen many candidates running for U.S. presidency, and we've been able to we've been able to cut down to only 2 candidates right now. But I think if there were maybe a set of criteria that candidates would have to assess themselves to see if they were eligible to be candidates in the presidency elections, then people would have fewer options, and then this would cause the whole political party, I guess, to be more united. With fewer options, I think that people would be able to resonate with one political party overall instead of just with one specific person. And I think that this would be more beneficial since people wouldn't use their identity politics to too far of an extent. So I think that if the options were narrowed down a bit, then people, instead of resonating with one person, they'd be able to resonate with one political party. And then that way they wouldn't be using their identity politics too much.
Well, that's actually really relevant what you've just said, Ali. And I just like to bring the point up to change the topic a bit. So because of the system, the way that the system is based, especially in the United States, in which the system, despite not officially being so, has simply become a system of 2 parties whose views every day grow drastically different. And this simply divides the country. This divides the nation. So what if the system is simply ineffective? It simply doesn't work the way that humanity is currently turning into.
The conversation that we've been having recently does remind me a lot. Yeah, thank you. And I couldn't get it. No podía decir la palabra. In which of Jonathan Haidt, which is an American social psychologist, and he brings out the concept of common enemy identity politics and common identity politics. And to what Rufo was mentioned before, Natalie then continued, is that the idea of, in politics, one strategy to gain supporters is to, as the name says, to have a common enemy, which we can see when Trump was running back when he beat Hillary Clinton, and something that we can also see in today's with the Democrats when calling Donald Trump the enemy. And I guess it can also be applied with Wilfer's example of Hitler. Now what he argues is that this type of identity politics is negative, because what happens is that you have the two edges and you're just polarizing, and then the conflict is escalating and it's not coming to a solution. However, then the positive or the good, let's say, identity politics is a common identity politics, which is something which is like an example is like Martin Luther King Jr. When he was during the civil rights movement, he said, okay, we have this group of people that are being oppressed. They're not having the same rights. And he brought this up and he did do identity politics, but his movement was to get recognized. It wasn't to harm, it wasn't to increase conflict. It was the opposite. And that's the good type of identity politics. However, the negative type is the one that's mostly used in politics, and it's what divides the country.
Okay, so does anybody else have any other remarks to do with identity politics, or would you all prefer to change? Okay.
So these are my final thoughts on the use of identity politics as a whole in politics. As someone who's resonated with the Democratic Party for my entire life, someone who has parents who are members of the Democratic Party, I expect the Democratic Party to take the moral high ground on some of these issues, and I expect them to be smart about the way they try to turn states and be smart about the way that they gain new voters. However, I don't see that in many cases, because it seems to me as if the Democratic Party likes to reinforce their views on certain identity politics topics, such as, I'll expand on this later, but LGBT awareness, the wage gap, and basically women's rights as a whole, which are very important, but I think they take a step too far. And that really makes certain people in the United States, especially in Middle America, feel marginalized, because they say, wow, it seems as if the Democratic Party only cares about these really small specific groups and they are forgetting about me. They're concerned about the minorities, and based on what their media tells them, they don't care about our country. They care about illegal immigrants who came into this country illegally and making them safe so that they can get more votes. And while it's a flawed argument, it's completely valid for them, because in part it's definitely true in the way some of these Democratic congressmen, congresswomen, senators are acting. And in my opinion, once you take that one step too far, especially being part of the Democratic Party today, they're really marginalizing themselves, and they're really going away from the fundamental beliefs which made the party so great, especially with Kennedy, especially with Bill Clinton, and especially with Obama. And I just feel like ever since Obama became president, we've delved into, while he was a good president, there was, with the formation of the Tea Party, there was such a huge divide between the two parties that they both went to the extremes. However, in that battle of extremities, the right and the Republicans have definitely won and have been able to indoctrinate their people into these identity politics to a much greater extent, and make minorities actually feel like they should come to their party. As you can see, Donald Trump has the highest polling numbers of any Republican president with the African American community and with the Latino community, despite his remarks about them. So, in conclusion, I feel like the Democratic Party has definitely failed on this issue, and they have failed the Middle America and the real working class who they had promised that they would work for.
I think it's very interesting how you, who I know to be more aligned to a democratic kind of political views, has felt like in recent years how the government or how the political party has been run has made you feel like your own people have put the needs of the few above the needs of the many, and so concentrating in small groups to seem I don't know, inclusive and trend or whatever, and that instead of joining people together like it's supposed to do, average people like yourself are instead feel more disconnected from the party instead of feeling more joined and more as a group.
I just feel like we're taking one step too far. We're not at the point yet where we can make these claims because LGBTQ rights and women's rights are very important. We have to admit that as a country, we have one of the best. We have really good systems. Like they're not at as serious advantage as anywhere else in the world, except for Europe, probably. So basically, I just don't think we're ready. Like we've achieved equality for the most part, and I think we need to worry about other issues before getting into complete equity of genders, of races, of religion, whatsoever. But now I think we should let's talk about something else. What do you suggest?
I mean, we've kind of dealt in a lot of subtopics here because identity politics actually goes into so many stuff. It's such a general topic that we've already touched into some sub-minor topics like LGBTQ rights. We could discuss that, or Wilfred probably wants to discuss the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. I don't know.
Haha, hilarious.
What do you suggest, Ali? Would you like to talk about the wage gap or LGBT awareness?
I think both topics are quite interesting, but I think the most prominent one right now, the one that's receiving more attention, I guess, lately is LGBTQ awareness. So if we dive into that topic, I think that would be quite interesting and fruitful.
Yeah. Okay. Would you like to open with your remarks?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that lately, with the rise of, with the furthering of social media and different platforms, we've really been able to see the diversity in LGBTQ communities, different perspectives, and different opinions on this event, the situation. And I think it's caused a further divide in political opinions as well, and not just political, but also social and economic. And I think, like yourself, as someone who is quite liberal-minded, I find myself agreeing or supporting a lot of the remarks being said. I think from what I've seen so far, I understand that several people disagree with the blatance or the presentation of different LGBTQ members, but I myself, I support each and every one of them. And I think it's important that we support and we respect and we care for these people, because I think the most important thing to highlight is that they're not any different from, I guess, what's normal, quote unquote normal. So I think that's the most important thing to emphasize right now.
I have a very fundamental question. When it comes to gender pronouns, do you believe that we should have to conform to the way different LGBTQ members define themselves as, or do you believe that we should have freedom of speech?
No, I think that we should always ask the person we're referring to and ask what they're comfortable with and what they think is appropriate. I have had this experience in the past over the summer, actually, when I was in the States, and I was meeting or I was at a restaurant, and the waitress asked that she be referred to as her or she. And I think that's something that we need to learn to respect. And for some people who are a little bit more closed-minded, maybe a little more traditional, maybe a little bit older, that might be something that might be a little difficult to do. But I think that it's what should be done, what needs to be done, because in order for there to be a respect and agreement in a society, there has to be for there to be respect in a society, we have to be able to do as others. We have to be able to respect one another, so that there's an overall respectful environment.
I believe that. Well, I know that. Well, do you believe that if people take this too far, it could be an infringement on the First Amendment? Which is to all the listeners out there, it's that the government cannot make any laws which prohibit the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, or freedom in general.
No, because I think that if we look at the topic of the First Amendment and its involvement in this discussion that we're having now, I think that it is one's freedom and one's right to be able to ask how they'd like to be referred to. I think that if we go into the topic of, for example, because I'm of this religion, I choose not to exactly respect or regard this certain group of people this way. But I think that if someone justifies that with their First Amendment, then someone else could justify the fact that they want to be referred to as a certain way with the First Amendment as well. I think that we just have to learn to respect one another. We might not always agree with what is going to be said or what's being asked, but I think as long as we have a common ground of respect, then that's the most important thing.
I actually agree with many of the things you said, Ali, especially about respect. I think respect is one of the key pillars that builds up society. But I'd just like to point out one thing, and I apologize, but it's just something that didn't really sit well with me. One of the first things you said, and I agree with the basis of your argument, but one of the justifications was that, for example, you mentioned that perhaps some people that would be more close-minded could be older or religious, and actually, I'm not sure about this, but I do believe that maybe calling or specifying that people that could be older or more religious could be a misrepresentation, because of the fact that perhaps not all racists, not all bigots, not all transphobes or homophobes are old or religious. Maybe they have their own reasons. Perhaps the fact that something happened to them, or maybe some closeted homosexuals even. And I just believe that making generalizations such as this is maybe even a bit dangerous, especially in such a charged atmosphere. And of course, the same way that this could be said, someone could also make the mistake of saying that younger people, more liberal, more progressive, and even if you were taking it from a religious standpoint, heretics, or they're all going to hell or something. And I think that these generalizations aren't very healthy and don't really help with the increase in polarization and such. And also, I'd like to mention something interesting that I also saw, the point of religion and the First Amendment. In the case of the First Amendment, I do believe that in reality, if a situation were, of course, up to the judge or up to the jury, typically judged on. So, and we have seen this in many cases that have gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has sided in both perspectives at separate times. So in reality, of course, it always depends to the situation.
Yes, I agree with the points you made about the generalization and how we must be careful with that. And I have to admit that I often fall victim to those generalizations, and I think it's just something that we all have to work on. Despite I guess my progressive mindset, I still fall victim to those things just because they're ingrained in our minds, I guess you could say, at the news, in the media, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that goes back to my point, just learning to respect one another and not stereotype or generalize. It's just one of those key things that we have to do to live in just a more welcoming and healthier society.
And I actually think that's a perfect example, and I congratulate you. That's a perfect example of the mindset that we should all have. A more welcoming mindset, a more accepting mindset, and simply not sticking to our ideals or just sticking to them and understanding and being more open-minded, as Ali said. And this is especially difficult in the age of the media, which Ali also mentioned, and I'd like to shift to this topic, because the fact is that the media has an ever-present presence, really, in our lives. And the fact is that it's so difficult to change our views or rather to keep our views, even in some cases, with the presence of the media so much in our lives, since we're constantly bombarded with information. Especially if we seek the information, we typically seek sources that are favorable to our own viewpoint. And of course, this is biased and negative because we simply surround ourselves with viewpoints that we agree with and don't expose ourselves to other, possibly more positive viewpoints. And I just like to really open to debate what you guys think about the influence of the media in our lives. And if it's influence, which is of course positive because of all the information that we receive, but of also what's its negative influence in our lives.
Disagree with one thing, Ali. I do agree that we should proceed with respect, but I think this is one of the examples where I feel that we have taken it a bit too far. And while it probably will be the right way to go in the future, we're not at that point yet because the majority of us are not ready to accept this as a truth. I don't think you've fallen victim to your mishaps, because how are you to know that these people want to identify in a certain way? And while yes, the media definitely has an influence on us, and I do believe that we should all treat people who decide to identify themselves the way they want with respect. We shouldn't be handing out basically like free cards to them to act in any way they want, because it's just it's once again dividing and it's more polarizing. Because honestly, these people, they have a better life than most gay people around the world. Because if you go to, for example, in Peru, where I used to live, there was news every month about how there were kids who were closeted gay and they would be killed because they were gay. I don't see that happening in the United States. In South Africa recently, there was a breaking news that there was a woman who was gangbanged because she was lesbian and they wanted to correct her sexuality. I don't see that happening in the United States. And so for me to see all of these things going on around the world and people complaining about the way that people are referring to them as, I find it completely despicable, and I find it completely disrespectful to all of the people who are actual victims of physical crimes and who are subject to basically hell because people are not ready to accept who they are. I completely agree with LGBTQ marriage, and I completely agree that they should have the same rights that every other person has, especially when it concerns their relationships which they choose to have. But I do not believe that we should conform to their pronouns just yet, because there are more important issues that we need to resolve. And if we, the United States, wants to start a consensus about this around the world, we first need to start by implementing these kinds of views all around the world.
Okay, that was a very strong opinion. I will say, for most part of what I've heard, I completely agree with you. I think that, I mean, I'm personally not ready still to call people by the pronouns that they impose on themselves, and then if I don't call them this way, be called disrespectful, because point one, it's not the standard norm. Sorry if I offended you by calling you what I normally call people that seem to be of your same gender. And I agree with what you said, that people are just not ready nowadays for this sort of change. I believe that maybe in the future we could normalize this sort of status, to call it some way. But yeah, anybody else?
Yeah, I agree with what Andres is saying. I do personally. I am ready to be ready to call them by the personal pronouns that they prefer. I am ready. However, I do agree with the point that the majority of the people are not ready, and I don't know how to word it. Wait.
It's okay. It comes. Trust me. I have experience with this.
Yeah.
We can all know this, Andres.
No, yeah, we got. I do agree with a lot of what Andres says, and I do think that in the future we are gonna have. We're gonna take that route. We're gonna end up having, and it's gonna be normalized to use the personal pronouns the other one prefers. However, because we're working towards that direction, we're having these changes, but I think that the changes are happening. It's not the time, because people are not ready, and we're trying to enforce them, and people are just not ready, and we can't push them to be ready. It takes time, and I think that eventually we will reach this point. But I also do agree a lot with what Andres says, that there are more important topics. Not saying that that's not important, but there's other things that we need to address right now before addressing personal pronouns. That's a big thing that I do agree with Andres' argument.
I believe that this is why the civil rights movement worked, because during the civil rights movement, what we primarily focus on the African American community, but the gay community also played a huge role in gaining their rights during the same time, although they didn't get them as quickly as African Americans. So this movement spilled over into the 70s as well. But Luther King's fundamental beliefs was that to initiate a protest, you need to identify a problem, identify an injustice. And once you identify that injustice, you go through 3 other steps, which are planning the protest. And by planning, there's 2 steps within, which is like actually planning what you are going to do and preparing for the psychological effects of this protest. And then once you get those rights after the protest, if you are successful, then you need to find a consensus with the enemy and become friends with them. But my point is that if the people around the world, while some people do see this injustice, and I certainly see why people can see this as an injustice, it's not a big enough injustice to cause a global movement such as the civil rights movement. And because of this, this is precisely what the point I was trying to make in my last statement, which was that we need to be looking at what is going on around the world before we start making gender pronouns as big of a deal as the media has made it up to be, and as many other people have made it up to be. So primarily, we need to find what the huge injustice is, which in our country, I think we have a lot more fundamental problems than gender pronouns. And we need to get behind those protests first before we can start tackling the issue of gender pronouns and whether or not they violate the First Amendment, whether or not they are just, whether or not people will feel comfortable with them, and whether or not we can live with respect in general.
Okay, so
And
no, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I was going to ask you a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, because we are running out of time. We've about broken 50 minutes. I think we should go ahead with your last thoughts on the issue, and then segue to an end in this podcast.
Well, I was just going to say that even though I do think that there are more pressing concerns and issues right now than gender pronouns, I do think that this issue currently fits within the issue of the LGBTQ community as a whole. And I think that if we go back in history and even looking at the present right now, we would be able to find some pretty big embreachments on violations toward the LGBT community as a whole, whether this be through gender pronouns or the inability to let them in a shop because someone doesn't agree with their sexuality or the way they look, or the fact that conversion therapies are still legal in over 25 states. I think if we looked at all of that, we would be able to see that there is enough evidence to point toward a revolution or a movement for the LGBTQ community. And while I do agree with the points made previously, saying that some people are still not ready for this to happen due to their slightly more conservative mindsets, I think that is something that will be happening in the near future. And with pride, I say that I look forward for this to happen, because I fully support the community as much as I think most of us in this podcast do as well. So I think that while there are some things that we still need to, I guess, get accustomed to, I think as long as we have respect and we show care toward one another, then this revolution will happen when it needs to happen. But I think if we look at just one issue, weighing it more than another, I think that won't be a proper solution to the problem. But I think if we look at it as a whole, I think we'd be able to find that this movement will happen soon, just as the way Andres quoted Martin Luther King's words toward the protest in the civil rights movement. But I think that overall, this is an issue that is of great importance, and I think it's one that we'll be able to see a lot of progress with in the future.
Okay, so thank you a lot, and I think that we overall had a very constructive debate not exactly debates, I would say, but discussions in all the topics that we've covered in this period of time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ali. And
hope to have you on another time.
Yes.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And so I think we should finish this.
Wrap up, I believe.
I just Lucas there for 1 sec.
Don't be a comedian. Don't be a comedian, man.
Okay. Thank you all for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to a new podcast in the future.
Make sure to tune into Pickle Boys every Tuesday.
It's Monday.
Oh, shit.